your ideal employee and the employee that's essentially going to run through the ranks are the ones that are essentially pushing the sliders forward on all of these skills. And when you're mentoring and coaching employees to grow their career, you should really, I think, be looking at the areas where they have room for improvement across that spectrum.
Welcome to Chilltown, where tech meets the road, where CTOs share the tales and the comments. So startups do big names, innovations unfold. How many CTOs will share their stories untold? Welcome back.
All right, let's get this thing going, Scott. Come on.
Oh man, we've been sitting around all day. We forgot to hit the record button.
Oh,
We just
Jesus.
had we just basically solved all the world's problems for you all,
Exactly. And we
but
just
we
forgot to hit the
forgot.
record. I forgot to
Yep.
hit the record
So,
button.
all right. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and smash.
Smash that subscribe button. All right. Anyway, Scott, welcome to another episode of the How Many CTOs Does It Take podcast. I'm Brad Hefta-Gaub, and you are.
I'm Scott Porad, and it takes more than two.
It takes more than two to remember to hit the record button.
That's right. Brad, I got a question for you.
Yes, tell me.
In my company that I'm working at right now, we do twice annual performance reviews.
Okay.
The big one happens in the fall, starting September 1st, runs for about 6 weeks. And then we do kind of a smaller one that happens like in April. So we're going into the big one.
Yeah.
And there's some stuff that my team does really good with reviews. And one of the things they do is we have what we call a pre-calibration.
Yeah.
And what that means is we have an engineering level competency guide. So you can imagine this, it's a spreadsheet. It has down the left side, and each row is a competency that an engineer might need to have. They're
Sure.
grouped into some groups. And then the columns are the different levels, like engineer, senior engineer, staff engineer, et cetera. And as you might imagine, as you go up in the levels, the competencies develop and grow and things like that.
Yeah.
And so we have a process whereby every engineering manager for every single engineer gives them a
Mm,
grade on every single competency. We're trying
mm-hmm.
to minimize subjectivity.
Totally.
And it's not, it's not an ABCD grade. I think it's 0 through 3,
Mm-hmm.
and 0 is not applicable. The person hasn't had a chance to do this, and 3 is, they're perfect every time, and everything in between, right? And it's been a really good tool for calibrating so that people are. It's been a good tool for discussion between engineering managers for calibrating. It's been a good tool for not being subjective about this person's really good at these things, but not as talented at these things. It gives us something concrete, that, for actually writing the review. It's concrete. But there was this conversation that came up
Wait,
the
wait,
other
hold on a
day.
second, Scott. Hold on a
Oh,
second. Before you
yeah,
go too much further down this, I just want to make sure that I'm on the same page with you and that
yeah,
our listeners are on the same page with you. So, first of all, what I'm thinking is this sounds very similar to what I would generically call a leveling guideline document.
yeah.
And it's very similar to what we talked about with Ted Neward when we were doing that conversation around hiring and things like that. He made the point that like you have to um, before you can hire, you need to know what skills you're hiring for, and
Yes.
knowing what skills you're hiring for is something that really applies well to performance reviews later. So it's like there's this like really important like before we hire you and then after we hire you, are you doing the job? Is that so?
Yeah.
One, we're talking about the same thing, right?
Yes, we are.
Okay, and then you started to say that you guys do this thing where you're essentially doing a calibration, and
Yeah.
that all the engineering managers essentially calibrate all the engineers. And then this, I assume the reason for this is then you have the ability to go, oh, it looks like you might get information out of that, like, oh, it looks like, you know, Janet, engineering manager Janet, consistently is a harder grader than engineering manager Rahul or something like that. Is that or at least then you have a conversation. You have a conversation with the engineering manager to say, well, on the competency call, I translate ideas into code, into clear code. Like this is what we mean by that. Is that kind of the idea behind
Yes.
this?
Yes, that's exactly right. And what happens more often than not, it's less, Janet is more rigorous than Jane, although that happens a little bit. It's more of, well, wait a second, what does ideas into code mean to you?
Yeah.
Because you're giving everybody ones on this, and this other person's giving everyone threes. And well, what you thought was, well, ideas into code means they thought of the idea themselves and they actually ran it through the whole process. And what I thought it was they just were good at taking a ticket and turning it into code. So that's it. Turns out what we actually this is our every cycle. What we see is we actually refine the language in the leveling guide as a result of the calibration because we find out that it's unclear to people, you know, what these words mean. Words are hard, right? So something
Totally.
like I turns ideas into code is a great one. That's a great one to add clarity for, like, well, what exactly do you mean by that?
Right.
Um, so that's more often what happens is that we end up making some adjustments because the group comes together to a shared understanding of what ideas into code means, and then as we do, we do this every 6 months. We will revise the language just to clarify what that means.
That sounds awesome. That's great.
Yeah, it's pretty good.
I will tell you that like in the organizations I've worked in, you know, once they get to the scale that your organization is at,
Mhm.
you really have to have that stuff written down somewhere, right? And you have to have
Yeah,
this kind of like structure to it, because otherwise it's just going to be like, how do you know that random engineering manager or random managers just they say somebody's great on their team, but like, what does great mean? Like, and so
exactly.
these are great. These are very useful tools, and I fully
Yep.
support organizations that use those. So what's the question?
Well, okay. The question is this. So there's five categories. I'm going to read them to you slowly.
And this is for engineers?
Software engineers, IC engineers. Well, actually,
Okay. Okay.
directors, everybody. Probably me. Probably my boss does this too. These are the five categories:
Okay.
communication and collaboration,
Uh-huh.
technical expertise, ownership and initiative, teamwork and empowerment, prioritization and execution. So let me just read those again because people listening at home might have not grokked it that fast. And these are just in the order that I wrote them down. They're not in any priority order. In fact, that's what I want to discuss with you as priority. Communication and collaboration, technical expertise, ownership and initiative, teamwork and empowerment, prioritization and execution. Those are the five categories. And within those categories, each of them has, like, 3 to 5 different competencies. Okay, so here's the question. We were having this conversation the other day about our engineering management team. So overall, we've got about 15 managers or so. And the question came up about how much technical expertise do we expect an engineering manager to have? Now,
Yeah.
let's set that question aside for just one quick second. That morphed into, well, should these be weighted, right? Is there one of the are these all equal, or are there some of these that are worth more than the others? Because, for instance, for an individual engineer, for say a a, a, a regular junior kind of entry level engineer, you would weight technical expertise higher and maybe prioritization lower because they're not really doing any prioritization in the weighting. I don't know. I'm just making that example up, but you can imagine how different levels of the organization might have different weights on what's important. Certainly, like, you want your staff engineers and your architects to have very high technical expertise, right? But you also want them to be good
Mm.
communicators, and you also want them to take ownership,
Yeah.
and
I'm having
and you also want
reactions.
them to, and
I got
want to have
feelings.
them play nicely with others, and you want them to be good at prioritizing. So, like, we got into this
Yep.
conversation about, should we weight these or not? And then it became like, well, God, they're all important, and you can make a case that every single one of them is the most important one. And so
Yeah.
that's the question I wanted to
Okay,
ask
so
you, is like, well, what do you think about that? What do you think about weighting them? Do you think there should be a weighting,
yeah.
et cetera, et cetera?
Okay. First of all, I love this question. I love this whole topic. It is so funny because literally on LinkedIn today, I just noticed this like notification from Greg Conklin, somebody who was on our pod a while back, where he basically commented on on a post that I'd made on LinkedIn where you and I had talked about engineering managers and the whole notion of like engineering managers as like people managers, or this notion of like autonomous teams without engineering
Hmm.
managers. You remember
Yeah.
that we talked about that
Yeah,
a
there's an
couple
article we
episodes
read.
ago. Yeah, exactly. And anyway, so he commented that he had listened to that episode and was like, "Oh man, such a great episode. I loved it." And I agree with so many of the things that you and Scott had to say about that. Okay, so the reason I think that's interesting is I think that was the essence of that conversation. Now, we were specifically talking about engineering managers, but if you recall, a big piece of that conversation that we had was the importance, why it's so important that you both have technical expertise and you have all those
Hmm.
people skills of communication, collaboration, ownership and initiative, teamwork and empowerment, right? Like these are so important for engineering managers, but they're all important. And if you take any of them away, like it doesn't stand
Yeah.
up on its own. And I would make that case in general for even for engineering job for individual IC jobs where these things are very important. And so
Hmm.
you mentioned staff engineer, right? Like I I think that a staff engineer that is incredibly incredible technical expert in some, you know, uh, in security or in LLMs or in whatever, who struggles at communication and collaboration, they're probably not
Hmm.
gonna excel
Hmm.
to the staff level. And so my instinct, I'm gonna get to your question. Your question is, should you rank these things, or do
Hmm.
you put weights on these things? And are there some roles where there are different values
Hmm.
that you would weight these things? And my answer is, I absolutely do not think you should weight these things. I think that in the leveling guidelines that I've seen in the organizations that I felt do the best with their leveling guidelines, they list all the leveling guidelines and they leave ambiguity, a little bit of
Hmm.
ambiguity in these guidelines, right? Now, we just talked about calibration and things like that. Make sure everybody knows what the words mean. That's like super important. But um, your ideal employee and the employee that's essentially going to run through the ranks, go from level 1 to level 2 to level 3, level 4, whatever. Those employees are the ones that are essentially pushing the sliders forward
Hmm.
on all of these skills, right? And when you're mentoring and coaching employees to grow their career, you should really, I think, be looking at the areas where they have room for improvement across that spectrum, and they should and you should try to find ways for them to grow and strengthen
Yep.
all of those skills. Um, and so I feel like if you do some kind of a weighting thing, you kind of just open the door to more
Hmm.
whataboutism, right? And the answer is they're all important. Like you said it. You can make a case that every one of them is the most important thing. Well, and that's because they're all
That's right.
important. I don't know. So that's my quick hot take.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where I'm at. Because as soon as I started fiddling with like, I had a piece of paper, made them all 20%, and then I said, well, let's adjust because there's 5 sections, so I made them all 20%. And then I was like, well, let's just try fiddling with the numbers here and see what that feels like. And it, I didn't know where to take from, right?
Yes.
Didn't know where to take from.
But didn't you tell me there was like a this is again more of a hiring thing, but didn't you tell me like you'd worked at an organization before that did you had a similar rubric where
Yeah,
you're scoring
yeah.
applicants on a set of requirements, and then you had like a single point that the reviewer was able to just throw in, yep,
Reviewer's
I
choice.
reviewer's
That
choice.
was
I'm going to give them a
that was
point.
for resume screening.
Yeah, but
And it worked. It was like a 10-point checklist, and basically we said, look, somebody who gets more than seven gets an interview, and if you don't get more than seven, seven or more, we take you for an interview. Seven or less, we don't, or six or less, we don't. And one of the points was reviewer's choice, and because they just saw something about your resume that that they liked,
and I think
and
that I think that that concept of what you did there, now admittedly, it's different than reviews and different than calibration, but I feel like what you were getting at that reviewer's choice or that the reader's choice there is this fact that like as much as we want to try to make these things objective and measurable, we are still dealing with people.
Yeah.
And we should have some tolerance for subjectivity.
Yes, we should. It's an interesting part of our sort of corporate world that we want to have things be so objective. And I don't mean to get political, but I think I think it comes from a point of litigiousness that's out there potentially. So, okay, this has raised a totally different topic. I was having lunch today with a former coworker who was a business guy. He's not an engineer. He was on the business side of things, and we were chit chatting about this, that, and the other thing. And he asked me an interesting question. He said, what's your framework for thinking about how to, put engineering effort towards the things that are hard to quantify? Because we were talking about how some companies just aren't good at that. If you can't put a number on it, it's like we're not going to do it. Um, but sometimes, and there's categories of things I'm sure in every department that are really hard to measure. And I have a response to that question, but I guess I'll share it with you, and I'd love to know your take on it. So I said, well, here's how I think about it. That's what I said. I said I think that's a uh, three prong strategy. Part number one is, and we were specifically talking about tech debt. By the way, we were talking about how do you invest in tech debt? How do you invest in the platform in ways that aren't directly attributable to some revenue? Scott, what's your thinking on that? And I said, I think about three parts. One is, well, if there's a business initiative that the platform needs to change, then obviously you do it. The second is you create a culture with your teams where if they see an opportunity that isn't going to dramatically increase the scope of a project, let's say adds no more than 10 or 20% of effort to it, go for it. Right. This just happened on our team a couple of weeks ago. The team posted, "Hey, we shipped this thing, and while we were doing it, we also cleaned up all this duplicate code. And instead of having 5 ways that prices are presented on our site, we now have one module for presenting prices." You know, and I just think that's great. And they took a little bit of effort. Nobody asked them to, and I think that's great. And I think you create a culture that allows for that and encourages it. And then the third piece is I think you just have to ring fence or allocate some sort of some level of resources. It could be a person, it could be some amount of time. Just say, look, this comes back to the subjectivity point. We're going to invest in some stuff that we can't put a number on, but based on all of our collective wisdom and experience, we just think it's a good thing for us to be doing.
Yeah.
What do you think of that? Think I was missing any parts, or would you approach it any differently?
I mean, I like your answer there, and it does kind of it also harkens back to that conversation that we had with Greg Conklin a couple months ago, where we talked about the whole issue of like when you have a retrospective or you have some incident and then you get like a backlog of stuff,
Hmm.
and there's the whole question of like how much do you invest in tech debt,
Hmm.
and he kind of made the point, which I sort of feel like you're making here, that you kind of you you know it when you see it. You know if it's actually adding value
Hmm.
when you see it, right?
Yeah.
Like there's some engineers, and I and by the way, not to try to steer the conversation necessarily back to leveling guidelines, but that's a great example where it would be really hard to write down in. I mean, you could definitely take a shot at like describing like the idea of as an engineer, I am good at identifying opportunities for improvement that add genuine business value, right?
Yeah.
And and you can try to describe that, right? But it's definitely going to have it's going to have a kind of subjective feel to it, right? Because
Yes.
business value is such a broad concept,
I
right? That's
know.
what your business friend was basically asking you. Like, how do you get your hands on this
Right,
thing?
because he's got a CTO at his company that's saying we should invest in all fixing this tech debt, and he's like, how do I'm a businessman. How do I think about that?
Right,
They want money, and
right.
they say they can't tell me what I'm going to get back for it. The way I work is I give people money, and then they give me back more money.
I love it. Business, I give people money, they give me more money. That's the idea of business. um, yeah, and we've talked about that on so many occasions. And okay, so now again, like, not to get back to your leveling conversation, but that's a super important skill for the engineer to be able to sort of have that business acumen to understand the value of something, to be able to then understand how to implement it. That's technical expertise. Prioritization and execution, right? Like making a really making a really uh thoughtful and professional assessment to say, I believe this is a priority,
Mhm.
right?
Right.
Like, I would say like a great example of this is like for a junior engineer, like, yeah, I want them to be able to prioritize between which task are they going to, which part of the task do they take on first, right? They're not making decisions about priorities for the team,
Hmm.
but they're certainly making decisions about priorities for the work that they do,
Yeah.
right?
Hmm.
And so a good example of this is like, I finished my task, but I didn't implement my unit tests, or I did implement unit tests, but I spent you know 5 times more time working on my unit tests, and I added all these extra cases that were redundant. Like that's poor prioritization,
Hmm.
and that's the kind of thing that we want to be able to somehow capture. That even as a junior engineer, you should know how to prioritize your own work, right?
Yeah, and I think something we want to teach our teams. So I'm going to use the phrase professional judgment, right?
Yeah, I like that.
Somebody, okay, I just told you about this team that like consolidated our pricing module, right? Because yes, there were a bunch of them, and they made one. And 20 of my team was listening to this. I'm not 100% sure it was like a pricing module. I can't remember what it was. So don't get upset with me if I'm remembering the wrong thing. I'm just using that phrase for illustrative purposes. Somebody had the professional judgment to say, yeah, it's worth it to tack on this extra time to fix this, right? And there was the engineering manager who had the professional judgment to allow it. There was the engineer who had the judgment to advocate for it. Um, I actually was talking to that engineering manager because I said to her, how did this come about? I'm
Mm,
curious to know what is it that I think this is a really good thing. I think we want more of this in our organization. How did this come to be? And she said, I always just say to my team, they're never going to give it, there's never going to be tech debt summer. There's never going to be some point where the business says to us, why don't you guys just take the summer and fix everything?
right,
And even if they did, I added to what she said, even if they did, I said, we're not going to fix it all in a summer.
right.
So you have to create a culture where it's more like looking for the right opportunities. And sometimes you find those opportunities. In fact, I was just talking to another engineering manager today who someone on his team found that opportunity, and we were discussing it, but it was just too big, right? You know, the engineer thought the project they were working on was an 8-week project for 3 people. And they thought they could like do this whole refactoring in the same amount of time. And the engineering manager was like, I don't know. That just seems too optimistic to me, right?
Yeah,
I think he's probably gonna go back to that person and say, yeah, let's not do this one right now, right? Let's find a
yeah.
different way to fit this one in because we're gonna take this 8-week project and turn it into 32 weeks, and everyone's gonna be upset with us.
So by the way, I have a couple of strong reactions to that. Love that story. I think that's a great example of these hard to quantify but really important skills that we want to somehow document in our uh, expectations for our team members.
Hmm.
And um, I think that's a good example that story is a good example where that engineering manager had to have a sense of business acumen to be able to judge the trade-offs of the cost. They also had to have technical expertise in understanding the complexity of the code, right? Um, and so that decision that engineering manager advocated for, and then they're going to have to go have communication and collaboration skills to sell it back to the engineer, right? So it's a great example where it's like like that simple thing that is an easy example of an everyday occurrence that a team is going to be confronted with plays on all of these different skills. And if you've got a big gap in any of those categories of skills, it's much harder to be a high performance team.
And there's one other puzzle piece you didn't mention. I'm not sure where it fits in this framework, but it fits into that decision making, which is as engineering leaders and engineering managers, we spend a lot of effort to build trust with our stakeholders. And what happens when you blow up the time when you take on one of these things that you think might only take a little bit of time, but ends up
And it
really
takes,
blowing up your project? You end up just eroding so much of that trust that gives you the freedom to do those things in the first place, right?
yeah,
And
for sure.
so you want to have a high level of confidence that you're not going to just cut your nose off to spite your face.
So 100% agree with that. And um, this makes me want to like mention something really important to our listeners. Um, we're talking about leveling guidelines. So Dropbox has an open source engineering career framework,
Yes.
and I think it's one of the better ones out there. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about it is it doesn't use the exact categories that you have. They have their own versions of it, right? But they have section like I'm just looking at it now. They've got stuff like, the core responsibilities they enumerate, but they have like these sections on like uh talent and culture and craft. That's this word they use, craft. And craft is where they kind of stick
Hmm.
the job specific things that you expect. And one of the things I think is really interesting is in the craft of an individual contributor software engineer and in the craft of an engineering manager, this, there is this there is a there is an overlap there. And you see that evolution of that overlap
Hmm.
as you become a more senior individual contributor. Your craft
Yeah.
expectations includes
Yeah.
business acumen, right? And strategy. And as an engineering manager, even in the lower levels of an engineering manager, you you've got this expectation around a set of business acumen and strategy. And as you grow in these levels, you have greater and greater expectations of the level of the
Hmm.
proficiency and the fluidity of the craft of whatever that skill set might be. And that to me is the answer to the question of how do you weight these things is you got to kind of put them out there in this blended craft.
Hmm.
And as you advance in your career, we're going to expect more of you. But they're always kind of there. They're all part of even the IC.
They're all there for sure. Yeah, there's always a balance of them. You're always trying to balance, these these. th- Let's I think analogy. It's like juggling. Honestly, you've got two hands and you've got five balls, and you're just trying to keep them. None of them. You don't want any of them to fall on the ground. So you're always kind of you're just always tossing them up
Yep.
and down, balancing them, so on and so forth. It's never static. And I don't think. I mean, I'm not a real good juggler. I have juggled. I've learned to juggle when I was like 10 years old. I got a book called Juggling for Klutzes and learned to juggle. And um,
Hmm.
yeah, when you're juggling, you're never in a stable position, right? You're always kind of doing it. Okay, so let's go
Right.
back to one other thing really quickly. I brought this up earlier in the conversation, and we should just make sure we check it off so that we're not leaving all of our listeners
Yeah.
waiting, just disappointed that we did not answer the question about how technical we think engineering managers should be. And the question often comes up is, should engineering managers code? Should they be coding? I have an opinion on that. You want me to go, or you want to share yours first?
You shoot first. I love it.
My point of view is a little nuanced. I feel like an engineering manager actually needs to be able to do two things. They need to be able to design, and they need to be able to validate that what their team is building is correct. Now, in order to design, you have to know the system that you're working on. And in order to know if what's building is correct, what's being built is correct, you have to know something about software. And so I don't necessarily know or even think it's actually that all that valuable for a manager to be in there on the front line coding. Although my first manager job, I was a player coach. In fact, probably my first two or three, I was coding all the time. I loved it. And the best way to understand a system and the best way to know if it's being built right is to also be in there yourself a little bit. So I think coding or not coding is the wrong thing to evaluate a manager on. I think to evaluate is the design, are their technical designs good, and is their stuff being built correctly? And the easiest way for a manager to be able to accomplish that is to just, be in the trenches a little bit.
So what? So wait. So what's your answer?
My answer is it's not necessary, but it is an effective way to do a part of your job well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I you're probably not going to get an argument from me on this,
Oh, rats.
but 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 I'm willing to play a little devil's advocate here, and I can tell you. I mean, I'll give you my straight up opinion about it. So one, my first job as manager, I was a player coach, just like you. I was writing code and managing the team. I mean, right now in my current projects that I'm working on now, I'm a player coach. I like write code.
Yeah.
I spent most of this week fixing some pretty gnarly bugs,
Mhm.
and that didn't take away and doesn't take away from my ability to lead and manage the team as well, other than the time aspect of it. And so I think that and then there were other times in my career, and I've worked in other organizations where the engineering managers had the technical expertise that you articulated, the idea that you're able to truly evaluate the work of your engineers, you're able to really guide them, you're able to evaluate designs. That requires a great deal of technical strength. And if you have that and you have that awareness of the system, but you're not coding, you're doing code, maybe you're doing code reviews, maybe you're just looking at the code, maybe you're not even doing the hands-on code review, but
Mhm.
you're observing the code reviews and you're observing the design documents, um, then that can be enough to keep that axe sharp and be able to do the technical thing. So I feel pretty strongly that it shouldn't be forbidden, and it shouldn't necessarily be required. I think it's situational based on the team, the enterprise, and the stage of the development of the software.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
Now, to play devil's advocate, one of the things that I have seen happen, and I've heard worst horror stories of this happening, is the engineering manager, particularly if they were like, a hot shot individual contributor who then flipped into management, and we didn't give them good coaching or growth or kind of like uh, opportunity to learn how to be a to do those other parts, the collaboration and the communication and the empowerment, all the things that we talked about in that other episode of what's so important about creating psychological safety. So if they like just kind of went from like hotshot engineer to now I'm the boss of a bunch of engineers, and they're kind of leaning into coding because that's like they can't get their team to perform, so they're writing the code themselves, right? That to me is a very clear signal that we have somebody that needs some coaching on how to be a better engineering manager. And so that when I have heard people say, well, we shouldn't have engineering managers coding, it almost always has been a case of actual toxicity or fear of toxicity around that type of a dynamic.
Yeah, and the same goes with code reviews. I actually am a little bit opposed to managers doing the code reviews. I'm not strictly opposed to it, but in general, I think it should be peer code reviews. Now, if a manager is in the cycle of people doing it, maybe from time to time they review something. But if everything has to be reviewed by the manager, then you're just building a disempowered team.
Not only are you disempowering your team, but you're not growing them too. You're not like
Right.
one of the best ways to become a better developer yourself is to read a lot of code by other developers.
Well, and as we've talked about, and we are now 30 minutes into this episode before AI has come up. As
Yep.
we've talked about, in an AI world, code review is more and more important. I think, in fact, you just
Yep.
tagged me on LinkedIn recently about somebody saying if you're using this AI, you got to be able to know what it's doing. You can't just take it and stick it out there.
Yep.
And some people, some engineers saying, I don't like that. And what I mean by I don't like it is it's not fun to just review. I like to write the code and create the thing. Just reviewing other people's work is not that fun. But then, as we also talked about in some previous episode, uh, there is some evidence that AI is actually better at reviewing code than it is at writing code.
Yeah.
And we get the robots to
Yeah.
review our code, and we can just be work for the robots.
I think that like what I heard you say, which does resonate with me, is well, I mean, I just going to go back to the whole concept of like, should engineering managers code? And my answer to that question is it totally depends. And so long as it doesn't get in the way of all the other important things we think that they should be doing. And if it's a supplement to creating that technical expertise and that guidance and that environment, I don't see anything wrong with it. If it's getting in the way of that, empowerment, whatever, then of course they shouldn't.
Yeah. Yes, you use the word supplement. I would use the word tool if it's a method for you to understand the system because you need to understand it, then go for it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
All right. So we've solved all the world's problems today.
We
Actually, we did solve
solved
a
all
problem.
of the world's problems.
We decided that we're in agreement that we shouldn't weight these factors, basically. You need to have all of them in equal
I feel
proportion.
pretty strongly that you don't. I feel strongly that you don't want to weight them.
I think
I
that's
think
right.
weighting them only turns it. I think weighting them only turns it into a game and gamification, and it doesn't really convey what matters about them, which is that this robustness of this of this kind of whole constellation of skills and craft that we expect. That's what matters.
It's a fabric.
It's a fabric. Yeah, I like that.
All right. Well, with that, Brad,
Another episode.
until next week,
Till next
in
week.
the books.
In the books.
All right, everybody, don't forget to give us a 5-star rating. We would love that. We are currently the number one ranked podcast in the category on Apple Podcasts for podcasts about CTOs.
I didn't know that.
Did you even know that they have? No, I made that up. They don't even have that category. But if they did have that
We
category
have
and
to
we
be.
had a lot of 5-star reviews, we would be number one. So thank you very much,
Yeah.
everybody, for giving us a review. And Brad, I'll talk to you next week.
Talk to you next week, Scott.
All right. Bye.
This episode of How Many CTOs Does It Take podcast was edited by Saffron Hefta-Gaub. Our theme song was AI generated by Brad. Please follow us on all the social media platforms at How Many CTOs Pod. You can find us on YouTube, LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, Threads, X, TikTok, and Patreon, or at our website at howmanyctospod.com. And remember to rate, review, and subscribe on the podcast platform of your choice. Thanks for listening.